there's a big inequality between being born in a European country, being born in a North American country, et cetera, and then being born in Pakistan or Afghanistan or Syria or whatever. I mean, one of the interviewees I spoke to was from Pakistan, had a college degree, was doing very well in Dubai, but couldn't even do his job properly because it took forever to get visas to travel on for business. And so he's looking at these options.
The Global Passport Investor is your go-to podcast. So welcome to the very latest episode of the Global Passport Investor. I'm your host, Eric Major, an investment migration veteran with over 30 years in the game. I'm also the founder and chairman of the Latitude Group, a leading international investment migration firm where our clients expect the world and we deliver it. If you're watching this on YouTube, please leave your questions in the comments section. And for those of you listening to the podcast, email your queries to questions@globalpassportinvestor.com. All right. So it's time once again to introduce you to my very special guest. Connecting in from New York is Atossa Araxia Abrahamian, and she is a journalist and the author of the Cosmopolites, the Coming of the Global Citizens. And joining me here from our studios in Southwest London is Kristin Surak, a professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and she is the author of the Golden Passport, Global Mobility for Millionaires. Atossa and Kristin, welcome to the show.
So happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Great. Well, listen, Atossa, I'll start with you because your book came out first, 2016. Am I right? 15. Oh, okay, even a year earlier. And you exposed to the reader of, I think you call it this weird industry called citizenship by investment. In the end, yeah, it's global citizenship for the rich. But you also presented in your book the story of citizenship from the Comoros Islands being offered to disenfranchised and poor people who can't afford buying it. So could you give our listeners a bit of color on both those extreme market realities, which your book presents so well?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was starting out as a journalist after graduating from journalism school, I kind of happened upon this world that you inhabit, like, by way of a conference in London. This was a Henley and Partners conference called the Global Citizenship and Residence Conference. I think there have been about a dozen since then. And I thought it was so fascinating that citizenship was being presented kind of as a commodity, life planning tool. You know, we know the story is citizenship is more than just the ties you have to a nation. It's the whole world of opportunity. But, being a journalist, I was thinking about all angles. I also was thinking about how this was a story not just about the ultra wealthy. And in the process of kind of poking around and asking questions, I learned about an extremely weird, and I still think it's extremely weird, affair that played out between the United Arab Emirates and the Comoro Islands. So in the UAE, as Kristin knows, because she lived there, there's quite a number of stateless people who, it's not that they can't afford to buy a passport, it's that they have never been given one in the first place. They've lived their whole lives, sometimes longer, sometimes for generations, in the sort of territorial Emirates. But for various reasons that we don't need to get into today, have been denied the citizenship of the country. So they don't have any, they're known as the baboon, they don't have any citizenship. And this is a problem for everybody, right? It's a problem for them. You don't have a passport.
Yeah, it's a paperless society caught in no man's land, and they were trying to solve it, I guess, and they came up with that unique idea.
Yeah, it was a problem for the Emirates too, because the UN was on their case about it. They couldn't really keep track of these people. And so one solution that emerged was to buy them passports in another country. And so this really illustrates the sort of trickle-down effect of buying and selling citizenship. It really doesn't just affect people who do this by choice. It ends up also affecting people who get thrown into it through, forces of history and economics and change.
Excellent. And Kristin, before we get into your story or your great book here, would you say that Atossa's work has, in many ways, influenced this body of work, and how so?
Yeah, it's interesting that she she was saying her book came out in 2015, which is precisely the year that I started getting into this field. And so in terms of her book coming out right then, it was, very useful as a resource to understand what was going on. But what's also interesting with her book too, is that she was talking about citizenship more broadly, having multiple citizenships, having no citizenships, and this sort of thing. Whereas what I got into was, how does this whole market work? So similar to Atossa, I kind of stumbled on one of these industry conferences. I thought this might be the final chapter of a small book on temporary guest work programs for labor migrants. And instead, it turned into this massive project I'm still working on nearly 10 years later, 300-page book that traces the market. So the countries that I went to 16 different countries, I talked to 500 different people to understand, how do you make supply? How does that connect to demand? And how does that market spin? Yeah.
No, it's fascinating. As I said to you earlier in our prep calls, I was fascinating by how much accuracy and detail you had about that journey. As you know, I was part of that for some of these programs that came about. And yeah, it's a very comprehensive body of work. So well done. And both of you, introduced this question of what some would say a questionable or dubious business being transformed into a multi-billion-dollar industry. But ultimately, would you say it just came about because it thrives on the global inequalities? And I know you touch on that. You want to expand a little bit on that theme?
Well, I think that's one of the big reasons for demand. There's often if we have a very privileged passport, we don't have to think about what it's like not to have been born into a country where you get a very privileged passport attached to it. But there's a big inequality between, say, being born in a European country, being born in a North American country, et cetera, and then being born in Pakistan or Afghanistan or Syria or whatever. I mean, one of the interviewees I spoke to was from Pakistan, had a college degree, was doing very well in Dubai, but couldn't even do his job properly because it took forever to get visas to travel and on for business. And so he's looking at these options. And so there's both intra-country inequality between whether you can afford this or not, and inter-country inequality between what you get with citizenship. And I think that structures a lot of demand in the market.
Indeed. And Atossa, your book as well did a good job of explaining how buying citizenship and pledging allegiance to another country kind of, I think you use the term, throws a wrench in the gears of what we believe citizenship to be. But for our listeners, how would you say so? Could you explain why?
Yeah, I think if you ask an average person, what does it mean to be, Belgian or Nigerian or Swiss, they would say something along the lines of, I have a connection to this place and, it means something to me. And I think that putting a dollar value on it really changes the meaning of what it means. And it kind of goes from being this sort of mythical, intangible, benefit or privilege to being something that can be placed on the market and has a price tag. This doesn't mean there's a misconception that this cheapens citizenship somehow. I mean, these things are pretty expensive, right? Like, I wouldn't call them cheap per se. And I don't know that in the aggregate, look, most people are citizens of the place they're born. That remains the case. And let's not lose perspective. This is a really small number of people. So we shouldn't overstate the effects of citizenship by investment, but it definitely has qualitative
No, absolutely.
effects.
I mean, in fact, I think I noted in your book, if I could find it, I actually took note of that because I knew this idea of, what does it really mean to be a citizen and what's the emotional connection, the genuine links, something we spoke a lot about with the Malta program in its infancy. How, is this an evolution where with the passage of time, this weirdness or uncomfortableness is going to evolve and change? And Kristin, in your book, you say few people these days see life insurance as morally repugnant for assigning a price for life, though many did in the 19th century, right? So we don't even think about that anymore. Like, oh, putting a price of somebody's life, buying life insurance. But, a couple of 100 years ago, that didn't feel right. So are we at this stage of an evolution in this topic, in this field?
It's a really interesting question to approach from a point of view of social science. So a lot of good economic sociologists have looked at how different things come to market, different things that were once seen as sacred. So whether it's, say, religious icons, whether it's the price of life in terms of life insurance, or even think of what it costs to do in vitro insemination or having somebody else carry a baby to term and all of this. There's a lot of different prices put on things that are often seen as sacred. And then a lot of work can go on around that to shift those perspectives. What I find interesting with citizenship, though, and this kind of connects to what Atossa was saying as well, that it connects to the nation side of the nation state. So, the kind of the social science term for a country is nation state. And you've got the state that gives you legal rights and the state that does the governing and stuff like that. And then there's that nation side. That's kind of the identity side, the emotional side and all that. And that kind of gets connected together in this notion of a country. And what's interesting with citizenship is it's a legal membership in the state, but it often gets associated with these national identity things as well. Right. But even then, I could, I happen to speak fluent Japanese. I lived in Japan for a very long time. I can do the Japanese tea ceremony. But if I show up in Japan, without a good entry visa and say, I identify as Japanese, they're not going to let me in. Yeah. It's just that identity side isn't enough. So it's interesting. I think particularly because nationalism is so strong that breaking that apart is kind of tricky.
Well, and Atossa, I'm sure you would agree, and I saw from one of your previous videos that I captured on the internet in Columbia University, that you have 3 nationalities. So I'm going to ask you to comment on what Kristin.
Now I have 4.
You have 4? Oh, yeah.
Meaning, I got my U.S. passport a year ago.
Oh, you got your U.S. citizenship. Well, congratulations. You're truly a global citizen. Are you free to tell us what the other 3 are?
Sure. I'm Canadian because I was born in Vancouver. I'm Iranian because my parents were born in Tehran, and I am Swiss because I lived in Geneva for 18 years, and I'm American because I've lived here for almost 20 years.
You're like a poster child for our business, Atossa. But I know from reading both your works that both of you are not 100% opposed to these programs, and that you do appreciate the nuances and the value that these programs that are offered bring, certainly to the recipient, but also to the recipient country. But in 2024, and I want to talk about this evolution, referencing 100 plus years ago, insurance was dubious. And even you, Atossa, writing about this, 8 years ago now, 7 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, it evolves very quickly. So in 2024, would you say citizenship by investment is a valid or dubious proposition, at least in your mind? And I'll take the point that you said earlier, in the big scheme of things, it's a small industry compared to all the types of naturalizations going on. But in 2024, who wants to tackle that? Dubious or valid?
Whether it's valid or not, it's not going anywhere. And so you got to learn to live with it, right?
Okay, I like that answer. You want to add to that?
I mean, for me as a social scientist, it's sort of like, well, it's something out there in the world. And so what I want to do is understand, what does this say about the way the world works? And I think what's sort of similar between Atossa's approach and my approach too, it's sort of like, it's small, but you can use it to crack open much, much bigger issues, much, much bigger debates. What does citizenship really mean? Yeah. What does this mean in terms of global inequality? And what I find really interesting is it's not just, the wealthy buying their way in and that's it. There's so many more nuances and complexities. It's about geopolitical inequalities as well. It's about, who has leverage over whom. I mean, it's kind of amazing that big states like the U.S., they can take their foreign policy and impose it on the naturalization policies of other countries. Who would have thought? And so I think but it does, lend some insight then into how geopolitics works as well. So I think it becomes, even if it's small, becomes a really interesting way to open up bigger global debates.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. With being a practitioner for 30 years, starting on the residency by investment, but now the last 15, pretty much from 2005 onwards, with the whole reawakening of the provisions that were there since 84 in St. Kitts. But it was really in 2005, 2006 that things started to take off in fulfilling a demand. And I've always found this confluence of the dynamics and the variables and the drivers as to what brings a foreign national to look into this. And we've come up with a nice little cutesy, what's the word, accolade or term to summarize what we do at Latitude. We enhance people's smile. We enhance their security. S for security there, M for mobility. We give them, and this is true for the American market, which we'll touch on in a minute, we give them an insurance policy. The world around them changes, which is what this is as well. And for some, it's also a lifestyle proposition. And then finally, with E being either education or employment opportunities for them or their children. So the demand side we get, the countries we also have, and you depict the stories in your book, how important these programs are to many of these countries. And this whole confluence, the geopolitical confluence and the dynamics that are at play. We're seeing them at play right now. I don't know who wants to tackle whether you guys have a view on the pressures that we're seeing. You mentioned the United States for sure. Last year they met with the Caribbean nation. Now, just last week, the EU delegate met with representatives of the CBI countries in the Caribbean. Are they justified to have these meetings, or are they strong arming these nations, or are their concerns legitimate in terms of the countries, the big countries? Because you mentioned they weigh into this, and your book touches on it. But is it justified?
One of the things that I found really interesting in looking at this market is that, so in a sense, to answer your question by taking a step back first, it's namely that we often assume that citizenship is about the rights you get in a country. Whereas when we're thinking about citizenship by investment, and this is true of any kind of citizenship as well, it's also about the rights that your citizenship gets you outside of the country in third countries, which is why the EU takes a big interest in it, because a lot of these countries have visa-free access to the EU. And so they're thinking, all right, so what's going on here? What are you doing, et cetera? That only Malta has visa-free access to the US, and the US has it's a complicated thing, still has final say on who gets in, et cetera. But it does kind of watch the countries in its backyard as sort of the global, dominant power at the moment.
And Atossa, you want to touch on this point?
Yeah, something that I thought Kristin did so well in her book was reveal the two-sidedness or hypocrisy of these kinds of interventions, where on one hand you have European lawmakers saying, oh, this is terrible, this is an infringement of national sovereignty, countries shouldn't do this, yada, 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 and have absolutely no problem showing up in another country and telling them what to do. So is it about sovereignty or is it not about sovereignty? I mean, all of these kind of contradictions come to light when we have these conversations, right? And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, very much so. And insofar as the word on the street from last week's meeting is that they're pressuring the island nations to up their investment threshold so that could lead to less applicants and more manageable applicants, and they argue would yield the same economic benefit, just higher amounts, less. But for them to get into that kind of discourse,
who's going to be a member of your country?
Yeah, exactly. You should raise it up. Less people, you'll still have the same impact. We'll be back next week. Make sure you implement that. I mean, it's
almost like the whole point of citizenship is restrictive.
Yeah, exactly. Listen, I'm going to take 2 seconds to give a quick reminder for those who are watching on YouTube to please leave us your questions in the comment section. And for those of you listening to the podcast, email your queries at questions@globalpassportinvestor.com. The greatest investment you could ever make is an investment in your future. Rift Trust and Latitude Group is the leading provider of residency and citizenship solutions for high net worth individuals.
Our clients are like our extended family. We're a global firm with a local focus.
What makes us truly unique is our leadership team. 100 years of combined industry experience, and we're working every day with governments to improve and build new residency and citizenship programs.
Obtaining a second residence or citizenship is the best modern insurance policy for you and your family.
Our clients
Expect the world.
we deliver it.
Hello to freedom.
Now, Atossa, I hear that you're working on a new book about weird jurisdictions. You define these as places of the world that have different rules from the country that we live in. You state that the binary of nationalism and globalism is just not an accurate description of the world we live in. Can you enlighten us further on what you mean by that?
Sure. So actually the origins of this project, well, this began when I was reporting on the citizenship industry, and I kept noticing people were not talking about countries or nation states. They kept talking about jurisdictions, which is really interesting because it's its own thing.
It is its own thing.
And the power of passports and the market for passports made me think about how, similarly to what Kristin was saying, the benefits of it are largely extraterritorial, right? You have diplomatic representation abroad. You're able to travel more if you have the right passport. And so I guess I just started thinking about borders and where they are and who they apply to, which led to this book, which has a bunch of chapters, each about what a weird jurisdiction. So there's everything from special economic zones to outer space.
Oh,
And there's been quite a lot of overlap with the territories of the citizenship market as well.
wow. Interesting. I was just a few months ago in Kazakhstan, and they're proudly launching their new tax residency program within the AIFC, the Astana International Financial Center. So like a free zone, Atossa. And they proudly mention how, well, in this particular geography of so many kilometers by so many, it's English rule of law, and we have very special tax incentives, and we're thinking, well, and we brought in tax residency provisions, not just for companies, but for individuals to move there. And yes, could they even think about creating a CBI program now, without spilling beans, because it's far from anywhere from being, something that's going to be launched. But, we've discovered over the years that there's, in fact, Americans have citizens, but they have nationals who are not citizens, right? And so this is where you could start peeling the onion. But yet, if the end result is still an American passport, like in Samoa, they're still traveling the world with the American passport. They just don't have the right to vote. And
they're not citizens.
And
they're
they're
just
not
nationals.
citizens. They're just nationals. So this is where you get into what I call, nationality or citizenship 201. But you're right. It's slicing the onion, and it's not the discussions that we're having, even with jurisdictions who do not have necessarily strong visa-free travel privileges. CBI and RBI, and Kazakhstan's the example of part of a bundle of policies, economic development policies that could try to attract and bring some stimulus to their economy by both the right individuals and the companies that they want to attract. So it's kind of being bundled, which I find fascinating from an economic policy point of view. Well, listen, I think we're coming to this part of the show where I tend to turn it back to our guests who share maybe a little anecdote, a little funny story, or a little observation. I know you've made quite some interesting references. It'll be hard for you to choose from what I read. You had quite a few of them in there, Atossa, as well. Would any of you want to share with our listeners something that you find unique or funny about this industry of ours, and that that you'd like to share with us? Who wants to have a first crack at it?
Overheard at one of these conferences. Maybe my favorite line from the whole enterprise: never be too rich, too thin, or have too many passports.
Say that again. Never be too rich, too?
You can never be too rich,
yes,
too thin, or have too many passports.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's something I'd like to hire that person, put them as our marketing head, and they'll keep us busy. Chris, I read your book, and you had quite a few funny anecdotes, some that struck a chord, certainly because we were there at the time. But what stands out?
I'm wondering what stands out for other people, because by this point, it's after a while, it just kind of becomes normalized. Yeah. But I think one of the things that stood out for me, at least at the end, was I also had to become British. Or I did become British in the end. And it was it was a funny thing going to all these conferences. I'd introduce myself and I was doing research on this, and people ask where I was from, and I'd say the US, and they go, "Oh, we can help you with that." Meaning, and I was like, no, don't worry. I don't, I'm a university professor. I don't earn enough money to pay double taxes. It's totally fine. But then, what happened along the way was the Brits changed their laws while I was on a work visa here. And I was traveling all the time as part of my job. And it was really touch and go as to whether I would lose my work permit, have to leave the country. And that was it. Mm-hmm. And I was sweating bullets for about 2 years trying to become a citizen in the UK. And I had to hire lawyers, et cetera. And it cost me about $10,000 US in the end. Sort that out, eh? Yeah. With this,
it's a stressful...
would be a normal quote unquote immigration route, which is not normal in a lot of countries, actually. But I don't know. What did you think was the funniest thing from my book?
Oh my God. I mean, I have these yellow stickies all throughout, but no, I think it's funny how, because you guys are, I would say, from the inside looking in. And it's always interesting to see your perspective on how these events, these conferences, for example, and who it's attracting, these meetings and discussions that you've had, trying to drill down on certain points and certain facts, and some of the comments that people comment. Maybe both of you would touched on this as well. And in our prep call, we did talk about how the industry evolved from an idea to the implementation of that idea. And prior to it being formalized and structured and institutionalized, I would say, it was very dubious and questionable practice that many countries, not all, but many countries engaged in, which is just, citizenship on the back of a pat on the back or something of the sort. So all of that changed, I would say, in 2005 onwards, whereas the baby steps of institutionalizing, structuring. And you mentioned this evolution, but even 15 years on, looking back to what we were doing then and what we're doing now, it's a whole different world. I was this morning interviewing Dylan Rafian from SRM, and she's with a firm that does due diligence. She's one of many that these countries are and jurisdictions are using to do their vetting, and the evolution of that sector, the technology behind it, the depth of what they can produce. And it's only one of a few other instruments that governments use to help make an assessment. So it's evolved a lot, is what I'm trying to say. It's been, it's been rendered more, just more organized. And I'd like to see that evolution. But when you guys were writing about this, it's just seeing how, even in the case of Malta, you did a good job explaining how it evolved from the original onset. And in the end, we got it to a much better place that had more components to it and just more interest from various stakeholders in the end as well, because it became a much broader program that engaged both the financial institutions, it engaged the realtors, and engaged the legal community, as opposed to just a national fund. So it was that evolution that I think was important. But that's the whole point. It's an industry that's still fairly young, right? It's evolving. I think we're coming to a point, if not already there, where, and I give the sport analogy, I don't know if it's fair or not, but I remember my grandfather questioning how the good old Montreal Canadiens hockey team could allow, somebody who's not from Quebec, let alone from the city of Montreal, playing on the hockey team in 1940 something, and how, and in the 80s, in the 90s, the Russians came to play and the Swedes were allowed to play. And I wonder, does a Montreal Canadian fan think about, about that anymore. Same with Manchester. Great franchises of sport have done so well. And somehow along the way, the mold is broken. Why? Because you want to have the winning team, right? You want to have the winning team.
If you look at the Olympics, you have naturalization for the purpose of maybe competing for a medal.
And it's, why is it that that's not a big deal in many people's mind, whereas someone who actually makes, I shouldn't say the sport people make a great contribution, certainly if they win a gold medal. But why is it? Why is the money side of it the question mark everyone's concerned about? Is it different? Should it be different?
Well, something your ex-colleague, Kristin, once very memorably said to me, I said, well, isn't this unfair? Like, isn't this unjust? Don't you have any concerns about that? And he said, listen, citizenship is already so unfair that we're making it more fair by giving people more access to more passports, even if it's with money. And you can object to the whole premise being unjust and undemocratic, and you can complain about it all you like. The guy's got a point.
Yeah, indeed. First of all, life is unfair. We can always start with that. But my colleagues in the Middle East, they've said something that struck me. It's the evolution now of these programs and how the price points also have evolved, certainly in the Caribbean, have democratized the business and the end user to levels, unexpected, let's say 10 years ago, where, let's face it, a lot of these programs are more in the mass affluent markets now, and how widespread that is reaching, and more and more families. So from that perspective, it's not as niche as people think. Certainly for Malta, it's very expensive. I was just in Vienna. I don't know if you know, some people in the industry would know that there are provisions in Austria, not a program, but a provision in their Citizenship Act, Section 10, Article 10, 6, Article 10, Section 6, where anyone who makes a significant contribution in the realm of the arts or science or sport, and they've added business, could be considered citizenship by merit, basically. And it's not a program per se, but there's a bit of a process behind that. And so, funnily enough, we've had a number of Americans who, for some reason, didn't feel Malta had the prestige in their mind, even though I kept on telling them Malta equals Germany. Malta equals France. It's the same. It's 27 countries. You have the right of settlement, and don't Latvia, Malta, Portugal. It's all the same. But no, they wanted to go that route. So we're getting them through that route. It's much more subjective, but I know that within the pile of applications that the cabinet will review in Austria, will have a few great violinists and a few good skiers, maybe, and another Einstein or what have you, and a few of our clients who hopefully will win the badge of becoming Austrian. But what I like about mentioning that is that they're the only country who specifically mentioned you could put it in the same pile as the artist, the musician, the sportsman, or sports lady, it's on the basis of merit.
And what's interesting to think about it in these terms as well, it's sort of like a lot of people are instrumental about citizenship. Often if you don't have a great citizenship in the first place, you tend to be instrumental in getting another one. And even if you have a pretty good one too, you can be instrumental in just keeping options open. Mm-hmm. And so it was interesting after Brexit in the UK when people started looking for that Irish grandparent so that they could still have an EU passport. And so in a sense, people, I've found in general, turn to citizenship by investment when other options aren't there.
For sure.
Because it's much cheaper if you have an Italian ancestor to, just get those documents and naturalize in Italy. Or you can do the same thing in Spain if your ancestors were in a former Spanish colony, et cetera. So it's usually when people don't have those other options open that they go for, all right, this is, tick the boxes, do the right thing, get the background checks. And
well, as you mentioned previously, it's still very much a pragmatic decision and approach that many of our clients take. And if these things exist and they can afford it and they meet the due diligence requirements, and that's the key to these things being sustainable in the end, the DD side has to be strong and compelling. But there's no excuse in today's world. That's a job that can be done. It's a job that the banks are meant to do and many institutions are meant to do. And there's no reason why citizenship units and governments can't do it to that same degree of depth. And there's a lot of great reasons. There's, I would say 90+% of our clients have every good reason to apply for these. Again, security, mobility, insurance policy, lifestyle, or education and employment. But it's also fair to say that it is a risky business. There's a certain percentage, 10% or more, I would say, that practitioners and certainly governments need to close the door on, and that you can only do if you have proper DD. Any parting comments, ladies, before we close it off? Do you guys have any other final pieces of wisdom or comments?
I'll give a quick pitch for Atossa's work, which is so much fun to read. So I've got this massive book that does the whole industry, and it is it's got Robert De Niro's in the first couple of pages.
Yes.
So,
Your book is so epic. Like I learned so much, and I thought I wrote a book about it and I still learned so much. So
that's a relief. It's been a relief that I talk to people who've been in this industry for a long time. They say, I still learned something. But Atossa's work is great because she's able to really get at these quirky things and unpack how the world works from them. So I'm super excited about your new book on jurisdictions too.
Yeah.
Well, I have a quirky passport story. I've sort of been collecting them. And I was talking to a friend the other day who is Israeli. And she was saying that she is by ancestry eligible for some pretty weird ones, not one, but two expulsion passports. So she's eligible for she's German because the Germans gave her Jewish family citizenship after they came back. And then she was also eligible for a Spanish one based on the Inquisition. So it's a pretty deep cut.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, so many Brits and Americans, frankly, are looking through their roots and figuring out whether they have that lineage. And if they do, they are happy to apply. And they've been applying in large numbers. Ireland got swamped a few days after Brexit, and pretty much ever since. We have a thriving at Latitude Citizenship by Descent business where we offer 6 jurisdictions. And that's a growing industry. And there's what's the statistic? Like someone once told me over 200 million people in the Americas that could have some lineage that they could apply. Is that
probably?
It's a massive number. And we thought, okay, well, we'll start looking into that. It's not by investment, but we're still focusing on the wealthy in the main. But as you said, if you don't have that lineage, you got 2 options. Hopefully you could buy it. If you can't, you got to do the time. You did the time. You stayed here. I got my UK citizenship as well last year after spending, COVID got in the way, but 7-8 years, and then finally got it. So, but we have some catching up to do. Atossa's got 2 other ones. So
I need that EU passport.
I think I'm technically eligible for Armenian citizenship, but I am not really going to.
I'll finish. I have this Norwegian. I'll just say that. He's a fascinating guy. And he's done very well, and he's in so many industries, and he's still very young. And he's out to beat you. He's already at 6, but he calculated he needs 1 more to be able to cover every country on earth. So he's working on that, but that's just his pastime. It's mostly for bragging rights, He just likes to put them on the table. Says, it's like a fancy car for him. But is
he skinny and rich?
Yes,
okay.
yes, yes. Speaks 6 languages. Very interesting chap.
Is he married?
That's the easiest way to get those 6 citizenships.
Well, he did go through us for all of them, I discovered. So you're right. That is still quite the easiest way and fastest in many cases. Well, listen, ladies, you guys have been great guests, really entertaining stuff. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And to our listeners or viewers, I invite you to join me next time to continue our world tour of all things citizenship and residency by investment. Thank you, and see you soon. Great. Thanks. Thanks, Atossa. Handshake. Yeah. Really appreciate you taking the time.